troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out of him and healed all of them. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what the ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated, and if the young people would come forward, please.
Mom's behind you.
Come on, sit down. Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see everyone. I'm going to talk to you about a lady. Her name is Jane Addams, and she lived 130 years ago. That means that was even before I was born. Okay. So it's that long ago, yes. 130 years ago, and she lived in a big city called Chicago. You've heard of Chicago, yeah. Well, she lived in a big city. And they had her family had lots of money. And so she was always well taken care of, although she was kind of sickly and had some health problems. But she grew up and became an adult. But she remembered when she was younger that she would go along in Chicago and she saw people that were living on the streets because they didn't have a home. And she saw people in Chicago that were very hungry because they didn't have enough food. She saw people who were sick and they didn't have any money, so they couldn't go to the doctor, they couldn't buy medicine, and things like that. And she felt very sorry for these people and thought about that for a long time. And when she became older and old enough and she inherited some money, she bought herself a great big house in Chicago, and she called it Hull House. Hull, H-U-L-L. She had this house, and what she would do is she would invite people who didn't have a place to live to come and stay there. And she would invite people who didn't have enough food. Well, actually, she had her staff make food so people could come and eat and have some food and then go on their way. And she also helped people that became sick and they couldn't go to a doctor or get medicine, and she would help them either bring a doctor in to look at them or supply them with medicine too. And that's what she did with her life. As a matter of fact, she was so good at this that other people started imitating her and doing some things the same way. They would help the poor, they would help the people that were sick, they would help the people that were hungry. And she even had a school in this big house for people who were to go to school. She was good at this, so good at that she became the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And she did that during her lifetime. So that's what she did. She saw that this was something that she could do to help people that had a lot of need. And if you were listening to the Bible reading for today, the Gospel from Jesus, Jesus talked about the fact that God cares for people who are sick, God cares for people who don't have a home, God cares for people who are hungry, God cares for people that are having trouble in their lives. And Jesus is kind of saying to us that that's something that we could do too. We can help other people. And the challenge for all of us is to find ways that we can do exactly what Jesus says we ought to do, and that is help people who have needs. Thanks very much. Good to see you. There's a story about a family that had sold everything to pay their bills, and they did this in order to pay their bills and put food on the table. Well, nevertheless, one time when they were out, everybody was out, and the family was out of the house, a burglar came in, knocked down their front door, and tried to burglarize the place. Well, the police officer was called, and he came, and he said, well, what did the burglar get? And the head of the house just kind of shook his head he being poor? You know? What did Jesus mean when he said, blessed are the poor? We know that Jesus was kind of a master at kind of keeping his listeners off balance. He always kind of said the unexpected. He praised people that other people would despise, and he lifted up the ones that other people would put down. He said things like, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And he also said, and for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. And so 2,000 years later, theologians are still trying to figure out some of these difficult sayings that Jesus left to us. The Beatitudes are one of those sayings, there are some of those sayings that are very difficult to understand. And they're found in two different forms in two different places. It's found in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, and in Luke it's called the Sermon on the Plain. Now, some translators think that the word blessed actually would be better translated as the word happy. But that doesn't really help, does it? Because if that's so, then Jesus is saying that you're happy if you're poor, and you're happy if you're hungry, and you're happy if you're downhearted. You're happy if you're hated, and happy if you're persecuted. Well, I think a lot of us would say, well, thanks, but no thanks. There's got to be a better way. Because we don't want to be poor. We don't want to be, we'd rather be like Michael Jackson. You know, back when he was pitching for Nike shoes, it was said that he made more money doing his pitch than all the workers in Malaysia who were working in the factories to make Nike shoes. You know, that's kind of what we want. We don't want to weep and mourn or be persecuted. It's bad enough that, you know, some people say that they feel like the whole world's against us. Matter of fact, one comedian once said, sometimes I get the feeling that the whole world is against me. But deep down, I know that's not true. Some of the smaller countries, like Switzerland, are neutral. Well, sometimes life is tough, but that's not how we want to feel. We're more comfortable maybe with the J.B. Phillips parody of Jesus' Beatitudes, when he said, happy are the pushers, for they get along in the world. Happy are the hard-boiled, for they never let life hurt them. Happy are those who complain, for they get their own way in the end. Happy are the blasé, for they never worry about their sins. Happy are the slave drivers, for they get results. Happy are the knowledgeable people, for they know their way around. Happy are the troublemakers, for they make people take notice of them. So what's Jesus saying about happiness? You know, we kind of need to know. You and I are not poor. We're not hungry. We're not downhearted. We're not hated. We're not persecuted. But of course, there are a lot of people who are not happy. There are even some studies that say that people in our affluent, safe society are more depressed than people have ever been. So what's wrong? Where do we find happiness? Well, I think first of all we have to get rid of the idea that Jesus is kind of a wild-eyed dreamer who was out of touch with what's going on in the real world. I found a sermon illustration that talked about Thornton Wilder's play called Heaven's My Destination. Evidently it's a comical play about a poor man who tries to live according to the Sermon on the Mount in everything that he does. But sometimes, all the time, the results are terrible. In one scene, he goes into his bank and he doesn't want to take interest on his savings account. And so he's arguing with a teller that he doesn't want interest on his savings account because that's called usury. And usury is kind of put down in some place in the Bible. Well, the thing is he's arguing with a teller. There are other customers nearby who hear this argument. They don't quite understand what he's saying, but they think that there's something wrong with the bank. And so they come in and want to pull all their money out of the bank and almost cause a run on the bank. Well, the point of the play is to say that following Jesus will be either funny or tragic, depending on your sense of irony. A certain author was teaching a class about the Beatitudes, and he decided he was going to bring in an illustration using the video clip from Cecil B. DeMille's movie, King of Kings. And so he's going through Cecil B. DeMille's with this video, and while he's doing that, he's got another television that's playing CNN. And on CNN, it happens to be at the end of the Gulf War, and CNN is broadcasting a speech by General Norman Schwarzkopf about how they won the war. And the general pulls out maps and diagrams and explains in detail how America's superiority in weapons and so forth easily beat the Iraqis. And the author is switching his attention back and forth between Schwarzkopf and the video, between Jesus' movie and the news conference. And he found the place where he's looking at the movie to the place where Jesus is talking about the Sermon on the Mount, and he's listening to it. And then as he watches Jesus and listens to what Jesus is saying, he thought of the irony of what he was seeing there. Schwarzkopf is saying how great the United States is because it's strong, it's powerful, it's able to overcome its enemies by force. And meanwhile, Jesus is talking about humility and lowliness and gratitude. And let's face it, Jesus' words were probably even shocking to the Jews of his day because they were living under Roman rule. They were an occupied country. They had Roman soldiers all over the place keeping order. Why didn't Jesus lead some kind of a bloody revolution and get rid of them? So, could it be that Jesus had a different kingdom of God in mind? Obviously, Jesus did have a different kingdom. He was thinking of the kingdom of the Spirit, the kingdom of God. But he was a realist. He also knew that his followers were going to be persecuted. He knew that many of them were going to be rejected by their families and friends. He knew that many of them were going to live in poverty because of their commitment to him. And that's even true today. According to an organization called Open Door, there are more than 380 million Christians who are suffering high levels of persecution and discrimination throughout the world. Jesus knew that being Christian could be hard. But as one author put it, he wanted them to know that happiness isn't dependent on outward circumstances. Happiness comes from within. Secondly, let's also realize that happiness is not equal to being wealthy. Another author tells us about visiting a very luxurious estate, one of the most luxurious that he knew in America. It had Italian fireplaces, it had Belgian tapestries, Oriental rugs, and rare paintings. And the author said to a friend, how happy the people must be who are living in this wonderful place. But his friend replied, no, they're not. Although they're millionaires, the husband and wife never speak to each other. Their place was really a hotbed of hatred. They had no love for God or for one another. So where do you find happiness? In your work? Well, it's a great feeling when you get something done and you feel happy when it's done and done well. But not everybody feels that in their jobs. Of course, there's their family. The Roper organization asked Americans what they believed constituted a good life. And the result indicated that first was material possessions, second was a happy marriage, and third was their children. Another study by Mass Mutual also asked about family values, and 8 out of 10 Americans reported that their families were the greatest source of pleasure in their lives. More than friends, more than religion, more than recreation, more than work. And even Better Homes and Gardens asked their readers, a majority of whom were baby boomers, more than half of them said that their relationships with their spouse was the single most important factor in their personal happiness. Even ahead of their children, their spiritual or religious beliefs, and their health, or even their financial security. Well, families are important. But families change, circumstances change. As one author said, a spouse can bring great joy in your life and then break your heart. So can children. And sooner or later, all whom we love leave home, whether for college, for a family of their own, or for the grave. If you invested all you have and all you are in your family, where will you be then? Finally, as another author put it, let's acknowledge that if we lived according to Christ's plan for our lives, we would have a zest for living in a world that knows no bounds. In a devotion I use that's printed by Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, Pastor Martin Duncan wrote about this text. He said, despite what the world might say, God is always declaring, blessed are you. In the Beatitudes, Jesus is not giving us some conditions for us to fulfill in order to be blessed. Jesus is declaring that God's blessings is for all, even most assuredly in times and experiences that the world despises, ignores, or overlooks. Jesus declares this blessing not to minimize the suffering, but Jesus promises that the blessings of God is ever more real, powerful, and lasting. Rather, this blessing is for us, and we are invited to enter the hard places of life to be a blessing to others. King Duncan, a Methodist pastor, summed up this text with these words: "And suppose we lived our lives having as our greatest values love of God and love for others. Suppose instead of burning ourselves out seeking wealth or status, we lived all our lives seeking to expand our divine potential so that